Hello, St. Barnabas, and hello, friends of St. Barnabas. You probably recognize where I am. I am in our beloved sanctuary, and if you don't recognize me yet, it's because I'm still pretty new. I am the pastor here. My name is Kyle. I wanted to record my weekly greeting and reflection from here in the sanctuary because I know it's a place that many of you miss dearly, a place where many of you have come to know God and come to know one another in very profound ways. And also because it ties in with something that's been on my mind in recent days and weeks, which is a story in the Bible, the story of King Solomon. King Solomon, as you may know, is the king who built the temple in Jerusalem. He's the son of King David, and David was a king who was a mighty warrior, and God said, "No, you've shed too much blood. You don't get to build the temple." But Solomon got to build the temple, which became, forever, basically, sort of like the symbol of God's abiding presence among the people of Israel. And he also built a splendid palace and splendid city walls. And his reign is the sort of the highlight of the ancient kingdom of Israel, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, a period of peace and prosperity, and this was when the territory was at its most vast. What's been on my mind, especially as I've been, I'm new here, and this is my first call, is a story from very early in his reign. It's told in the 3rd chapter of the book of 1 Kings. So Solomon is new. He's just become king. He's spent a chapter or two getting his house in order. Unfortunately, in that time, that sometimes involved a fair amount of bloodshed, which is narrated in the 2nd chapter. But then, so he's set up, and chapter 3 begins. He goes and he goes to make sacrifices to God, and God comes to him in a dream afterward and says, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon says, "Well, you've made me king. I'm king in place of my father, and that's great. And of this great people, and that's great. But I don't, strictly speaking, know what I'm doing. I've never done this before. I've never been king before." And Solomon was pretty young. So he said, "What I need you to give me, God, is a wise and discerning mind so that I can govern this people and know right from wrong." And God is pleased with Solomon's request. God says, "Okay, done. I'll do that. I'll give you more besides." And so Solomon is known in not just as the most prosperous of the kings of ancient Israel, but also as one of the wisest people in all of the Bible, in all of the history of God's dealing with the world and with the people of Israel. The books that are attributed to him we call them the wisdom literature in the Bible, the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, if you count it, the Wisdom of Solomon, great books. And that was him, because God gave him knowledge of things in heaven and things on earth, and the ways of God and the ways of people, and made him a wise and discerning ruler. As a new young cleric myself, I identify with that in a certain way, and so his prayer is my prayer, or something very similar at any rate. And because I'll let you in on a little secret, a bit of a nerd, the fact that he's all about wisdom and knowledge, that was always something I strongly identified with when I encountered this figure of King Solomon as a child in Sunday school. Here's the thing, though. Having encountered him as a child in Sunday school, you learned the Sunday school version. But as I grew older, when I was about 14, I think it was when I read the Bible for the first time, and I encountered unfiltered Bible. And the story was a bit different, because you see, not only was Solomon the wisest of the kings of Israel, and in some ways the greatest, but despite having received this wisdom from God in a vision, he also, in some ways, really screwed up the job. And that was because he failed to do the one thing that a Jewish king was supposed to do, which was sort of devoting himself and keeping the people in the country devoted to the exclusive worship of God. he facilitated the worship of other gods later in his reign, particularly Egyptian gods. His wife was Egyptian. And things, they start off with this great promising start where God makes him so wise, but then things still go badly. And by the end, God tells him, despite all the things you've done so well and the ways in which you've been so wise, you've also messed this up in such a way that this is it for the kingdom. After your death and the life of your son, this kingdom is going to be split in two, and so it was. And never since that time has the Jewish people been united under a single king. And I remember when I read that as a teenager, I really didn't know what to make of it. I actually found it really kind of sad that this wasn't the kind of story that I thought it was. This wasn't the kind of story of Solomon getting this gift of divine wisdom and then living by it, ruling by it. It was a much more complicated story. He is great, and his wisdom books are wise books. And he also, his wisdom wasn't enough. He still screwed up the job. It's hard to say that he's just a good guy or a bad guy. In fact, it's hard to say that pretty much any of the figures in the Bible are just good or bad. In fact, it's hard to fit them into any narrative or any arc whatsoever. And I want to submit to you that for real people in the Bible and for real people like us and people we know, and also I think real communities of people, God is real and true and present, and it still doesn't fit any particular type or arc or narrative that we want to impose on ourselves or our lives. But here's the thing. Now, speaking in Christian perspective about the Jewish scriptures, despite Solomon's ambivalence, despite the fact that he is wise but also screws it up, and despite the fact that the history of the two kingdoms is basically a mess after that, a few shining points of exception, though they're pretty much a mess too, this is the history that, through God's presence in it, eventually gives birth to Jesus. Eventually it becomes the history, the community, the family from which Jesus emerges, through which thus God enters the world. And so, in aspiring to be like Solomon, as I in some ways do, maybe what we're also aspiring to, or really aspiring to, is more to be like the Virgin Mary, to be the person who has God inside of us and is the gateway through which God enters the world. I know you have been that for people. You, as individually and communally, you have been that for one another, and you've been that for other people. And I hope we can continue to be that for each other and for our community and the world in which we live. And I believe that by God's mercy we will. So, thank you for listening once again. Hope I'll see many of you in our Zoom worship on Sunday, and that the days will not be too long before I see you here in this place in person. God bless.